So we are dealing with our trig word problems in real life situations. So I have again up at the top the equation that we're always trying to fill in the values for. And again, it's either sine or cosine, never tangent. Most of the time they tell you whether you're using sine or cosine, so that makes it a little easier. Sometimes, not always, but generally they do. So we have to be able to figure out our A value, which is our amplitude, our B value, which is your frequency, how much does it occur, your C value, which we have not dealt with too much yet. We will have some phase shifts in our problems today, though. Remember, those are the ones that move left and right. And then our D value, which you guys are all very used to finding at this point in time. That's our midline moving our graph up and down. So you have to use all those things in order to create your equation. So here's an example of a sinusoidal model that they gave us. They gave us the picture of the graph instead of writing out in words what our scenario is. So what we need to be able to do first is decide what are our variables that we are dealing with here. So if we look at our graph here, what are the two variables we're dealing with?
Temperature and base.
One would be temperature. The other one is dealing with time. So step one, done. Got our variables, temperature and time. So over here, number 2, we have to determine whether this is a sine curve or a cosine curve. So if we look at this, though, I don't know exactly what my midline is just yet, but I know it's approximately here. Did my graph start at the midline, or did it start above or below it? Starts below it. So which kind of curve is this going to be? Cosine. Sine always starts at the midline, cosine does not. So this one's a cosine curve. Next step, step 3, we have to find the wrap line, which if you remember, your wrap line is also referred to as your midline. So you guys know how to do that. We were just doing that before. We had to do our high plus our low divided by 2.
So does it call like 87?
I would go more with 85 as my estimation. For my high, yeah. What would be my estimation for my low? I'd go with 35. I do it because that's going to give us a nicer number, no decimals. So 85 plus 35 gives us what?
So we're allowed to do that here on that.
So our midline would be right about there at 60. Remember also when it comes to writing our equation, that's our D value. So we have one of our values already. We got to start figuring out the other ones. So 4, we have to figure out our amplitude. So here I am at 60 at my midline. We said our high was what? 85. So how high did it go up? 25. From 60 to 85 would be an amplitude of 25. Because it's how high I am from my midline. So here is 60. This is 85. I'm 25 away. All right, next one, we have to find our period, and then we have to find B. So for this one, our period is 12 because we're dealing with the 12 months of the year. So our period is 12. So then for our B value, take my period, set it equal to my period formula, 2 pi over B. Let's have you go ahead, cross multiply. Let's find our B value. Yeah, cross multiply. I'm having you do it on your own. You guys can cross multiply. What do we get for our B? Pi over 6. So I now have my A, my B, and my D value. We just have to find our last one of C. So again, remember your phase shift. That is your C value. Now this one does have a phase shift, and we're going to kind of estimate approximately where the phase shift is. See, here's our low. That's where our graph should start. And we're going to say that's approximately at 1 to the right of the 0 part. We can estimate like that on these ones. So now we can write our equation. So I'm going to use a capital T to represent for my temperature. So capital T equals. This graph starts below my midline. So is it going to be a positive 25 or a negative 25? Negative. It starts down, it's negative. So negative 25 cosine. So my A value goes in front of my cosine. Next comes our B value, which we said was pi over 6. And then it's your T minus 1. I'm going to use little t for temperature. And it shifts to the right 1, so it's minus 1. And then plus our 60, because the graph started down. And that would be our equation for that one. Because I have a phase shift to the right 1. Because it's not a low here on the starting line, it's over 1. So our next one, example 2, the depth of water in the bay can be modeled by an equation in the form of this. Little d equals A cosine B of T plus D, where T represents the number of hours since high tide, and D represents the depth. The maximum depth of the water is 36 feet. The minimum depth is 22 feet. High tide hits every 12 hours. Now, a couple of cool things they already did is they already, as I said, told us what equation we're using. We're using cosine for this one. We're not having a sine curve. We're going to have a cosine curve for this. They told us that already. Are we going to have to find a C value? Is there going to be a phase shift here? No, because again, they told us to use this form. All we have to find is an A, a B, and a D. They're telling us right there. There's no phase shift on this one, so that's making our lives a little bit easier for that. So they want us to sketch a graph of the scenario for 2 full periods. 2 full periods. Label the points on this curve that represent high and low tide. So we got to remember to go back after we sketch it and label our high tides and our low tides. So in order to do that, we're going to have to figure out our A, our B, and our D values. Then we can actually sketch it. So I'm going to make this just a little bit bigger so that people can hopefully see a little bit better. So we have always done our D value first. We got to find our midline first. So that's our high plus our low divided by 2. That's going to give us our midline. So what do we get? 36 plus 22 divided by 2. 29. So over here on my graph, I'm going to put a line for my low of 22, my midline of 29, my high of 36. And I'm going to draw in my dot for my midline of 29. Nope, 22. See, right here, depth is 22. So again, there's our D value. We already found one of them. Bless you. So now next, let's find our A value. So for the A value, our midline is at 29 right here. Our highest is 36. So how far apart are those? So our A is a 7. So next we have to get our B value. And that comes from up here. High tide is every 12 hours. Since we're cosine here, remember cosine starts high, goes down, and comes back up high again. So high tide to high tide, that is your period. So our period is 12. Because again, you just got to know how the cosine curve is. It goes high, low, back up to high. So for our B value, I'm going to take 12, set it equal to my period formula of 2 pi over B. Let's have you guys go ahead and solve for B. Yep. Some of you may start to get it memorized because 12 is a very common period in our word problems. Because high tide to high tide is 12 hours. That's one complete cosine curve. No, 12 is your period. B is pi over 6. So now when it actually comes to sketching our graph, our B value never really helps us figure out anything. The one thing we're going to want to know here is when do our key points happen? So key points, remember, is your period divided by 4. So if my period is 12 divided by 4, our key points are going to happen when? Every 3. So every 3 hours, we're going to get another key point. So down here on my graph, I'm going to go every 3 hours and put a little tick mark. So 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, and 24. I went to 24 because remember, they wanted us to do 2 complete cycles. So one cycle happens in 12 hours. The second cycle would have happened in 24 hours. So once you have those on there, go ahead, let's start sketching it. So our high tide starts us off. So we start off at 36. Our next key point would be right there in the middle at 3 hours. We would reach our midline. Our low would happen at 6, which would be 22. Yep. Then at 9, where are we back up to? Midline. And at 12, we're back up to 36. And then let's repeat. So then at 15, midline. 18, I'm at my low of 22. My midline. And then 24. So there's my cosine curve. So again, they told us to label though. This would represent a high tide. How many other high tides do we have here? 2 more. So I'm just going to draw an arrow. That's a high tide. That's a high tide. And then they also want us to label our low tide. We have 2 of those in here. So then our last part, they just want us to write the equation. Again, we are following what they gave us up here. So my equation is going to start with D equals. Our A value was 7. And then cosine. Our B was pi over 6. So I'm going to put pi over 6t. And then plus what? Plus 29, plus our D value of 29. So these ones really aren't that bad. You just have to take the information they give you and interpret it to figure out your A, your B, your C's, and your D's.